Have you ever wondered what the first Christian churches were really like? When we read the New Testament, it's easy to picture something familiar: a building with pews, a pastor at a pulpit, and a congregation listening quietly. We might imagine them saying, "Hey, want to come to my church on Sunday?" But what if I told you that the picture we have in our minds is almost nothing like how the earliest Christians actually met? The reality is so radically different, it might just change the way you see church forever. Let's travel back in time, not just to see history, but to rediscover the heart of Christian fellowship. The New Testament doesn't show us buildings constructed for worship. It doesn't show a single preacher delivering a sermon while everyone else sits passively. So, what did it look like? The Apostle Paul gives us a direct glimpse in 1 Corinthians 14. He writes, "What then, brothers? When you come together, each one has a hymn, a teaching, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for edification." Think about that for a moment. Each one has ... double quotes. This wasn't a one-man show. It was a dynamic, participatory gathering where every single person was expected to contribute. One person might share a song God had put on their heart. Another might offer a piece of teaching they'd been studying. Someone else could share a revelation, a word of insight directly from the Spirit. There was no fixed program or rigid liturgy. The Holy Spirit was the director, leading the meeting through the believers themselves. It was an open, interactive, and mutually edifying experience. In this model, there are no passive members. Paul makes this clear in 1 Corinthians 2, where he describes the church as a body. He says the Spirit gives gifts to each one for the common good. He even emphasizes that the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. In the early church, everyone had a role, everyone had a voice, and everyone was essential. This kind of intimate, all-participatory meeting wouldn't have been possible in a massive auditorium. For practical reasons, these gatherings had to be small. And where did they happen? The answer is simple. In their homes. The book of Acts and Paul's letters are filled with references to Christians meeting in houses. We see it in Jerusalem, where they met from house to house. We see it with Cornelius, Lydia, and the Philippian jailer, whose entire households became believers and their homes became places of fellowship. Paul sends greetings to churches that met in the homes of Priscilla and Aquila and of Philemon. The church wasn't a place you went to, it was the people you were with. As a group grew, it didn't look for a bigger building. It multiplied into another home. It was an organic, decentralized, family-based network. Now, what about worship leaders or prayer leaders? Again, you won't find those roles in the New Testament. God gave songs to whomever he wished, and that person would share it. Prayer wasn't led. It was something everyone did. It was a spontaneous, heartfelt conversation with God. The early believers didn't need someone to guide their prayers. They had direct access to their Father. But some might say, wait, didn't they meet in the temple in Jerusalem? Yes, Acts 2 says they met in the temple courts and in their homes. But we have to understand what the temple was. It wasn't a Christian meeting hall. The temple in Jerusalem was the center of Jewish sacrificial worship. Its large outer courtyard was a public space, like a town square. Rabbis taught there, people prayed, and business was done. When Jesus and the apostles taught in the temple, they were doing public evangelism, not holding a church service. They were sharing the good news in the open, just as they did in marketplaces and other public squares in different cities. Sometimes, all the believers in a city would gather to hear a visiting apostle like Paul. Acts 20 describes such a meeting in Troas. This was a special event, more like what we would call a conference today. It was an exception, not the normal weekly pattern. The regular, day-to-day life of the church happened in the intimacy of their homes. And what about breaking bread? This phrase in Acts refers to two beautiful things happening at once. It was a time to remember the Lord's death and resurrection, but it was also a real, shared meal. This wasn't a sterile ritual with a tiny cracker and a sip of juice. It was a full, joyful feast, often shared with those in need. It was fellowship in its most tangible form. This practice has its roots in the Jewish Passover, which Jesus celebrated with his disciples at the Last Supper. Passover was a meal celebrated at home, with family. The early church was, in essence, a family of families. Life for them was completely intertwined. Acts tells us they met daily, not because of a rule or obligation, but because they genuinely loved each other and wanted to be together. Their gatherings weren't driven by regulations, but by the new life God had ignited within them. In fact, the phrase "go to church" doesn't even exist in the New Testament, because they understood that they were the church. So, how did people get saved? It wasn't primarily by being invited to a home meeting. The meetings were generally for believers. People came to Christ through the public preaching of the apostles and through the everyday witness of ordinary Christians in their workplaces and neighborhoods. People saw their lives, heard their testimony, and were drawn to the reality of Jesus. Once they were born again, They were welcomed into the fellowship of the home gatherings. Now, let's bring it to the present day. Many of our modern church services are designed as semi-public events, focused on attracting newcomers. But in doing so, we often sacrifice the very thing the early church prioritized: mutual edification. When everything revolves around one person preaching from a stage, the congregation becomes an audience. The each one has principle gets lost. Many believers can remain spiritually immature because they are never given the space to exercise their own spiritual gifts and contribute to the body. They become spectators in their own faith journey. This brings us to a crucial question we all must ask ourselves. Does my church experience look like the one we see in the New Testament? Is it a place of mutual sharing and building up, where every member is an active participant? Or is it more of a performance, guided by human traditions? The goal isn't to criticize, but to rediscover the powerful, life-changing dynamic that turned the world upside down. It's a call to seek out true, authentic fellowship, where the work of God can be fully expressed through His people. Let's look beyond the buildings and the programs, and seek to be the living, breathing family of God that He always intended us to be. Thanks for watching. If this video challenged you or sparked something in you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content that dives deep into the heart of faith. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.